Evil has no borders. Cruelty is not confined to any one era or epoch. Wherever there are human beings, there is wickedness. Today, I present to you 3 tales from the past. Stories too astounding to be true, but too weird to be anything else. 3 tales which uphold the age-old history of violence, the lore of gore, la Tradicion de Sangre. Drinking whiskey in the kitchen and telling scary stories around the fire. Music, monsters, and mayhem. Killers, cannibals, and cults. Fearful fiction and furious fact. Tall tales and terrifying truths. This is a scary home companion. "14-year-old Magdalena Solis never intended to become infamous as the High Priestess of Blood, but life has a funny way of working out sometimes. Magdalena was a sex worker in Monterrey, Mexico in the early 1960s, one who had considerable experience given her age. Alongside her pimp/older brother, Eleazar, Magdalena also ran a successful side hustle as a fortune teller and mystic, which brought her into the orbit of the Hernandez brothers, who came to Magdalena with one hell of a job offer. Santos and Cayetano Hernandez were a pair of petty criminals, con men, thieves, and in 1962 they had stumbled across the biggest potential score of their lives. The tiny village was called Yerba Buena, just a couple of hours from Tamaulipas, and it was comprised of maybe 50 or 60 people in total, most of them illiterate, all of them dirt poor, and completely cut off from the rest of society. The brothers had found this place, and although it had no money, it was so isolated, and by their measure, so filled with rubes. The Hernandez brothers somehow managed to convince the entire village that they were prophets for the angry Aztec gods who were hungry to return. The villagers were Mexican, but they bought into this hodgepodge of Aztec and Incan mythology, which was all from South America and goes a long way towards telling you how gullible they really were. In any event, the prophets convinced the village that the end of the world was imminent. If they wanted to survive, they needed to believe, and they needed to obey. The rewards would be staggering. Yerba Buena was near the Sierra Madres, and inside a cave system below, they claimed were a vast series of treasures to be reaped by the faithful. The whole village bought into it. The Hernandez brothers took over, lock, stock, and barrel. They knew all manner of cons and sleight-of-hand tricks from their previous scams, and they used them all to perpetuate their grand lie. They also continually dosed everyone with cannabis and peyote. This was also a big help. The villagers had no money, so the prophets demanded other forms of payment. Service. Yes, including that kind of service. And not just from the women either. Everyone was essentially a sex slave for the Hernandez brothers. Orgies commenced on a nightly basis. When they were in need for a little walking around money, the Hernandez brothers even sold some of the younger villagers to sex traffickers in Monterey. Eventually, the gravy train was starting to dry up. As gullible as the villagers were, it had been quite a few months with lots of slaving and none of the promised riches. Not to mention, the world still hadn't come to an end, so the prophets were on the verge of losing their credibility. They drove to Monterey, where they were familiar with the sex trade, and they found Magdalena Solis. They brought her back to pretend to be their goddess, Coatlicue. And this was an easy choice for Magdalena to make. She got to walk away from prostitution and start living the life of a goddess. As payment for her acting job, Magdalena was given all of the cannabis and peyote that she wanted. Picture the scene. The Hernandez brothers call everyone in the village together. The room fills with smoke, and as it clears, a young woman has appeared before them. To restore their lagging faith, the great goddess Coatlicue had come to them. Never before had Magdalena known such adulation. Is it any surprise that she did what she did next? Living as a goddess, being told by everyone around you that you are a goddess, and no doubt suffering from a level of PTSD from her previous lifestyle that we can only try and comprehend, not to mention fueled with pot smoke and peyote, Magdalena realized that she was actually the goddess that they said she was. It would be easy to say that Magdalena cynically took the reins of control from the prophets just so that she could be in charge. But it wasn't that simple. Magdalena became convinced that she was the goddess and that these people were her slaves. And now the prophets served her, not the other way around. The Hernandez brothers were smart enough to hold their tongues because they were starting to understand only now how dangerous Magdalena was. The first dissenters to her rule were savagely beaten, burned, mutilated, and then hung. This quelled much future dissent. Although the orgies were a regular staple at this point, the new goddess had her own bloodlust, which quickly became integrated into the sex. The orgies became ceremonies, blood rituals, first with the killing of animals and the drinking of their blood, and then the cutting of human flesh. The blood that the villagers drank was always laced with peyote and cannabis. Things escalated from there. As Magdalena learned more about the Aztec and Incan lore that she was based on, she learned about the ritual of cutting the hearts from living humans and then devouring them while pulsing and fresh. She came to believe that the gods could only be nourished by hot, freshly drawn blood. Magdalena moved the orgies out of the village and into the nearby cave system, so that they could more easily hide the remains of their victims deep down below. This went on for weeks and months. One night, a teenager named Sebastian Guerrero is out late at night. God knows why he's out so late and out so deep into the big nothing, but Sebastian sees flickering lights coming from one of those caves. So he goes in for a closer look. He sees a debauched sex orgy with people drinking blood from a chalice and a goddess cutting the heart out of a dead man's chest. Can you imagine being this kid? Dead of night, middle of nowhere, running his ass off while a whole village of naked, blood-smeared lunatics chased him by torchlight. Sebastian kept going. He went all the way to the nearest police station, which was about 15 miles away. 15 miles! He told the cops his tale. Do you know what happened next? Yeah, right, kid. Sex vampires? Get the fuck out of here. The cops thought he was mentally ill, touched. Except for a detective named Luis Martinez, who took pity on the kid. All right, let me drive you home, and on the way you can show me this alleged cave. 2 days pass. Detective Martinez never returns to work. Sebastian Guerrero never returns home. The cops aren't laughing now. So they go to the village in numbers. They investigate the caves, where they find bodies, including the fresh corpses of Sebastian Guerrero and Luis Martinez, both of whom have had their hearts cut out. The villagers resisted, but only briefly. Some were killed and the others arrested. Even in jail, they all kept their faith. None among them would speak out against the goddess. Magdalena Solis was sent to prison for 50 years for the murders of Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. The remains of 8 other victims were recovered, but there was no telling how many lay hidden down deep in those caves. After the High Priestess of Blood went away, there are no official records as to what happened to her. While it's safe to assume that Magdalena died in jail at some point, if she didn't, then her sentence would have ended in 2013, when she was 65 years old. Maybe she got out and went to find a new village. In the mid-1500s, there was a war going on for control over what was then called Araucania and is now called Chile. The locals were a collection of indigenous tribes and communities called the Mapuche. And the heels in this invasion angle, of course, were the Spaniards. The conquistadors wanted to tame these people, to control them along with all the other natural resources that South America had to offer. For the Araucanian War, the point man for Spain was the governor, a dastardly fellow by the name of Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza, the Marquis of Cañete. Almost 500 years later, and this guy is still radiating douchebag energy. In one of the Marquis's dust-ups with the locals, he took a few hundred Mapuche warriors as prisoner. As was the custom at the time for the Spanish, the Marquis decided not to kill these men, but to cut off their noses and one of their hands. Then they could return to their respective villages, mutilated and humiliated in defeat, in hopes to crush the spirit of the entire resistance. One of the prisoners that day was a fierce Mapuche warrior named Galvarino. Galvarino was especially dangerous in combat, and he was a leader among the warriors. So, to set an example, the Marquis cut off both of his hands. He underestimated Galvarino. When Galvarino returned to the War Council, he showed off his stumps and used them to rally the people. With leather bands, he affixed knives to his wrists and vowed to go back to war to kill all of the invaders, even if he had to do so with his teeth. Seeing how he moved the people, the War Council gave Galvarino his own squadron of Mapuche warriors. Alongside Caupolicán, who was the leader of the Mapuche, Galvarino went to war against the Spanish. They fought in a brutal campaign of assaults and skirmishes, all leading up to the Battle of Milarape. This is where the combined forces of the Mapuche would clash with the Marquis of Cañete himself, Governor Mendoza. Galvarino rallied the troops, whipping them into a war frenzy with what must have been the greatest halftime speech of all time. We fight for our country, for our women and children, so that they aren't mutilated as I am. They have wreaked manifest damage upon us since the day they entered our kingdom, and they will never stop, not until all of us are brought to heel. Let no man flee. They are all to die today. And then Galvarino ran ahead of the other warriors, charging headlong towards the Spanish, literally leading the Mapuche into battle. I really wish that this story had a better ending. Instead, it has the ending that you think it has. Some 3,000 Mapuche died that day, with several hundred others being taken prisoner, including Galvarino. Galvarino was taken before the Marquis, and the handless warrior was sentenced to death. Some say he was hanged. Others say he was thrown to the dogs and eaten alive. Either way, Galvarino's life ended that day. But his legend lives still. These days, when we need to remember something, we put it in our phone, set an alarm. Before phones, we would have to write things down or take a picture. And before that, We had to remember shit. There was an enormous span in the history of humanity, encompassing virtually all of it, where things like paper or something to write with, or the ability to write, were very, very rare, usually found only among the wealthy elites of any given culture. In South America, before Galvarino, before the white man had ever set foot in this part of the world, if something was truly important, then you had it tattooed on you. No one had paper, but everyone had skin. The skin artists, or dermographers as they are sometimes called, were skilled artisans among the Chimu people in ancient Peru. And there is no way to adequately convey to our modern sensibilities the significance of these tattoos. It wasn't just adornment. It wasn't about telling society who you were. It was also because when you died, you brought that art with you to the other side. You had your identity, your home, your deities, your family history, your points of pride, all of it etched into your skin. It was a part of your soul. It wasn't mere adornment. It helped you through your journey, through time and life and death. This was so long ago that we know very little about the individual dermographers. Over the last few decades, hundreds upon hundreds of mummies have been uncovered in Peru, so there are extensive records of the preserved tattoo work. One artist stood out for both craftsmanship and sheer body of work. He's one of the few that we know about. His name is Kokual. We know the most about Kokual because he worked with some of the highest echelons of Chimu society. The religious leaders and prominent citizens, they went to Kokual. So archaeologists, anthropologists have found more work by him than anyone else. Kokual was widely traveled, especially for the time, and his work has been found all the way from the northern end of Peru down into Bolivia and east into Brazil. Skin artists in this culture were well respected, and Kokual and his family became very wealthy over time. He even had a coterie of adherents, servants, family, and friends who lived and traveled with him. But everyone had to start somewhere. And in his early days, Kokual inked whoever needed it, whoever could afford it, from warriors and hunters and farmers to sometimes men of low character. One such man, who would today be considered a loan shark, asked for a tattoo of a deity that Kokual had never heard of before. And this was the first time such a thing had ever happened to him. The client described a man and a woman bound together with their own exposed entrails. Kokual did the piece as requested and then moved on. It did make him very curious. He had never heard of these bound figures, and he was a very learned man. But it would have been impolitic to ask questions, especially to a man of such low character. Some 20 years later, things were very different. When Kokual was tattooing a local man of wealth and influence, he saw a tattoo similar to that one from long ago. And this time, he did ask. As he worked, he praised the wealthy man's other tattoos, and then remarked about the two bound figures. The wealthy man was high on endorphins, as Kokuol knew he would be. His tongue was loose, and he spoke freely about what he called the dream walkers. He explained that although everyone slept at night, some people were chosen, and while they slept, their spirits would leave their body, escorted by ghoulish beings from another place. These dream walkers were few in number and very selective, but they could lead the chosen to the heights of success. The man submitted himself as living proof. And when his time came and his body perished, he would cross over to the other side where these beings, these two bound figures, would be waiting for him. With the markings that he wore on his skin, the figures would easily recognize him and take him to his great reward. Over the next 2 years, during his extensive travels, Kokuol met more and more people looking for such tattoos. The influence of these dream walkers seemed to be spreading, and it filled him with disquiet. There were not only the two bound figures, but a butterfly woman, a man cloaked in fire, a woman with a split mouth, and, most troubling of all, a woman who wore human skins as clothing, which reminded Kokuol of a dream that he had once when he was a boy. Upon returning home from a long work trip, Kokuol was greeted at the edge of the village by the hanging body of a local man. It was said that this man had been killed for the brutal murder of his own family. This man had cut open his wife and children and bound them together by their entrails. Kokuol was struck with fear because he knew this man. He had inked the bound figures upon him so long ago. What had Kokuol become a part of? All around him he felt a growing corruption amongst the people. Not just the petty criminals and the warriors and the dirt farmers, even the high priests and the community leaders, more and more bore the markings of these dream walkers. Kokuol had been away from home for many weeks. He returned to find a stack of work requests which had piled up in his absence. More people than ever wanted his deft, skilled hands, and many of them wanted depictions of their dream walkers. It would have been rude, and in some cases even inflammatory, to turn down any of these requests. They did not come from men who tolerated rebuke. Instead, Kokuol wrote each of them in turn, explaining that he was going away to visit his wife's family for a month. He would handle all of their requests when he returned. And then quietly, under cover of night, Kokuol rounded up his coterie of adherents, servants, family, and friends to pack up all of their personal effects and as many weeks' worth of supplies as they could carry before slipping away from the village, never to return. At first, Kokuol didn't know where he was leading his people. They went south and inland, away from the sea, away from where he knew people lived. He wanted a quiet place to start over. Kokuol no longer trusted society. He sought to start one of his own. After some weeks, they came across the hidden entrance to a valley which had laid untouched since before man walked. It was filled with bountiful vegetation and wild game. In such a place, they would be able to settle down, start their own community, and never be found. And so it came to pass. For almost 600 years, before a renegade anthropologist named Neil Wallace discovered the descendants of Kokual and his people, and the Dreamwalkers, who still haunted them. Thank you for listening to another episode of A Scary Home Companion. If you'd like to hear a little more about the descendants of Kokual, check out the classic episode, All Around the Maypole. You can find A Scary Home Companion on social media, Instagram and Facebook regularly, Twitter not so much. Or email us directly at ascaryhomecompanion@gmail.com. It helps the show immeasurably if you submit a review online to whatever platform you listen on. You can also support us through the Patreon page, where you get bonus material, making of videos, and so far, 10 bonus episodes. But that number keeps growing. There's a lot of new exclusive content coming to the Patreon in 2022. Do not miss out. The episode was produced, edited, and in large part conceived by Jeff Davidson. Featured music by Mountain Cult, Downbeat, Don Trust, and DaliLama. As always, Chelsea Oxdendine with the theme music. But as legend, you can't kill that motherfucker.